I hadn't planned to come home that afternoon. I was supposed to visit my sister in the next town over, a quiet weekend away to clear my head, but something nudged me to stop by my house first, that small refuge I'd poured decades of memories into. As I pulled up the driveway, the scene unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't escape. Movers were hauling boxes and furniture out onto the lawn, stacking my life into neat piles under the relentless sun. My heart caught in my throat. I stepped out of the car, clutching my purse like a lifeline, and called out, "What's going on here?" The men paused, glancing at me with a mix of hesitation and awkward politeness, but said nothing. I moved closer, peering into the open front door where more boxes waited to be filled. My breath hitched. My favorite armchair, the one I'd always sat in by the window with a book, was already gone. The kitchen table where my family had gathered for countless meals was wrapped in plastic, ready to be loaded onto a truck. Then, as if that wasn't enough, I spotted a crumpled note taped to the doorframe, the handwriting unmistakably my son's. I unfolded it carefully, the paper trembling in my hands. "Mom, I'm sorry, my wife's parents are moving in with us. There's no room for you anymore." The words blurred before my eyes and a cold wave of disbelief washed over me. No phone call, no warning, just a note that felt like a slap, neat and clinical, void of any warmth or explanation. Neighbors peeked from their windows, and across the street, their eyes wide with sympathy. I could feel their gaze burning into me, a mixture of pity and quiet judgment. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat growing heavier with every passing second. My home, the place I had nurtured and loved, was being emptied while I stood helplessly on the sidelines. I hesitated, then walked toward the front door. My son appeared, his expression tight and unreadable. His wife stood behind him, arms folded, her eyes sharp and unyielding. They looked like they were waiting for me to make a scene, but I swallowed the shock and pain and simply said, "What is this? Why didn't you tell me?" My son shifted uncomfortably. "It's just easier this way, Mom. We didn't want a big confrontation. You know how things are." I shook my head, disbelief turning to quiet hurt. "Easier for who? You've been planning this without me." His wife stepped forward, voice cold and precise. "We need the space, and this arrangement isn't working anymore. You've had your time here." The sharpness in her words cut deeper than I expected. I opened my mouth to protest, to remind them of the years I'd sacrificed, the mornings spent making breakfast, the nights waiting up for them, the countless favors and support, but no words came. Instead, I felt a strange numbness settle over me, a hollow ache that seemed to echo inside the empty walls around us. The movers continued their work, oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding at the threshold. Boxes labeled with my name were stacked like trophies of my displacement, my life being parceled out and removed piece by piece. A photo album slipped from one of the boxes, its pages fluttering open to a picture of my late husband and me on our wedding day. I knelt to pick it up, my hands trembling. My son's wife glanced at the album and sneered, "You can take that with you if you want. It's not staying here." I clutched it to my chest and stood, meeting their eyes with a steadiness I barely felt. "I need some time to think," I said softly, turning away before the tears could fall. As I walked toward my car, neighbors whispered among themselves, their eyes following me like silent witnesses to my unraveling. I felt exposed, stripped of dignity in the place that was supposed to be my sanctuary. Once inside, I sat in the driver's seat, the engine running but unmoving. Memories flooded me, the birthdays celebrated in the living room, the laughter of grandchildren echoing in the hallway, the quiet evenings spent knitting by the fire. How could all that be dismissed so casually? How had I become invisible to the people I loved most? I reached for my phone, fingers trembling as I debated who to call. But no one's voice sounded right in that moment. Instead, I locked the door and sat, letting the silence envelop me. Outside, the house I had called home was being emptied, and inside me, a profound emptiness took hold. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the scattered belongings and the crushed rose bushes in the front garden. I realized with a bitter clarity that my life was changing in ways I hadn't anticipated. The people I trusted most had made a choice, and I was no longer part of it. Yet, beneath the shock and sorrow, a quiet ember began to glow. I didn't know it then, but this moment, as devastating as it was, would mark the beginning of a journey I never expected to take. But for now, all I could do was sit behind the wheel and watch my past being loaded into trucks, my future uncertain and uninvited. I found myself sitting alone in a small cafe down the street, the bitter taste of black coffee matching the swirl of emotions inside me. The noise around me, the clinking of cups, the murmur of conversations, felt distant, almost unreal, as if I were watching life happen from behind a glass pane. I stared out the window at the quiet street, trying to make sense of the chaos that had invaded my home, my life. The betrayal gnawed at me, sharper than any physical pain I'd ever known. How had I missed the signs? The hushed conversations I'd overheard between my son and daughter-in-law, the dismissive remarks about the old house needing too much work, the sudden changes in their schedules that left me feeling sidelined. I'd brushed them aside, telling myself I was just being paranoid or overly sensitive. But now it all made a cruel kind of sense. I sipped my coffee, my hands trembling slightly, and thought back to the days when the house was filled with laughter and warmth. I remembered the mornings spent tending to my garden, the smell of fresh earth mingling with the scent of blooming roses, the very roses now trampled in the front yard. I recalled the way my grandson's eyes lit up when I baked his favorite cookies, the soft "thank you" he whispered as he ran out the door to school. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago. A tear slipped down my cheek and I wiped it away quickly, unwilling to let anyone see my vulnerability. I wasn't used to feeling this small, this insignificant. I had been the family's anchor, the one who held everything together, and yet here I was, cast aside without a second thought. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little respect they had shown me. They hadn't even bothered to discuss the ownership of the house before making such a sweeping decision. It was as if my presence was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. I felt a flicker of anger rise within me, anger at the betrayal, at the silence, at the disregard for all I had given. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old messages and photos, searching for some reassurance or a sign of love. Instead, I found conversations that hinted at plans I hadn't been invited to share, jokes about downsizing and making room that now cut like knives. The realization settled heavily on my chest. They had been planning this for a long time, quietly reshaping their lives without me. I glanced around the cafe, noticing the other patrons absorbed in their own worlds, unaware of the storm raging inside me. I envied their normalcy, their oblivion to the upheaval I was enduring. Yet beneath the despair, a quiet resolve began to form. I couldn't let this be the end of my story. I had to find a way to fight back, not just for the house but for my dignity, my place in this family and in the world. I thought about my late husband, the man who had always been my steadfast partner through every trial. He had taught me to stand firm, to protect what was mine. If he were here now, he would tell me not to give up, to gather the strength I didn't know I still had. I clung to that thought like a lifeline. As I sat there, memories of past conversations with my daughter-in-law surfaced, their sharp edges cutting deeper than before. The thinly veiled disdain in her voice when she spoke about the burdens of having an elderly family member living with them, the offhand comments about selling the house once Mom moves out. I had dismissed those remarks as bitterness or stress. But now they looked like pieces of a carefully constructed plan. The bitter truth was unmistakable. They wanted the house more than they wanted me, and that realization stung more than any rejection. I had spent years pouring my time, my energy, my love into that home and those relationships, only to be discarded when I was no longer convenient. Yet, amidst the pain, a seed of clarity took root. I would not be erased so easily. This was not just about a house, it was about respect, about standing up for myself when those I loved had turned their backs. I knew I needed to gather information, to understand my rights, and to prepare for the battle that lay ahead. Finishing my coffee, I pulled out a notebook from my bag and began jotting down everything I could remember: dates, conversations, threats veiled as jokes. I made a list of neighbors who might have witnessed unusual activity around the house, people who might support me if I asked. I felt a flicker of control returning, fragile but real. Before leaving the cafe, I called my sister, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, "but I'm not ready to give up, not yet." Her warm reassurance over the phone was a balm to my bruised spirit. She promised to help me find a lawyer, someone who could advise me on my rights and the next steps. As I walked back to my car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and determination. I was grieving the loss of the home I thought I would always have, but I was also awakening to a new sense of self, one that refused to be silenced or pushed aside. The house might be emptying out, but inside me something was filling up, a fierce resolve to reclaim what was mine, not just in property but in identity and respect. I didn't know how the story would unfold, but I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer willing to be invisible. The next morning, sunlight filtered softly through the curtains of my modest apartment, casting gentle patterns across the scattered papers on my kitchen table. I sat there, surrounded by legal documents, old photographs, and a stack of unopened mail that had accumulated over the past weeks. The house that had been my sanctuary was no longer mine in practice, though legally I wasn't yet certain. I needed clarity, and soon. That afternoon, I met Janet at a small diner downtown. She was an old friend from years ago, someone I trusted implicitly. Over cups of tea, I told her everything: the note, the movers, the cold indifference of my son and daughter-in-law. Janet listened quietly, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. After a pause, she said, "I heard from a neighbor that your son and his wife have been talking about renovating the place, possibly selling it once you're out." The words landed like stones in my chest. Selling. They hadn't even discussed this with me, yet plans were already in motion to erase my connection to a home I'd built with love. Janet's concern was a lifeline. "You need to get your hands on the deed and any legal papers you have for the house," she advised. "If you can prove ownership, you have a chance to stop them." That night, I rummaged through a filing cabinet tucked away in the corner of my apartment. Among the receipts and old tax forms, I found a folder labeled with my late husband's name. Inside were the original deed, mortgage documents, and even a letter from the lawyer who had helped us purchase the home years ago. My fingers trembled as I held the papers, feeling the weight of their importance. A memory surfaced then, my husband's steady voice, always urging me to keep these documents safe, to never sign anything without reading it thoroughly. I hadn't realized how crucial that advice would become. Now, those papers were my shield. Determined, I called Richard, a retired lawyer who had been my husband's best friend. We hadn't spoken in years, but I hoped he would remember me and, more importantly, help me. When he answered, his voice was warm and surprised. "Margaret, it's been a while. What can I do for you?" I explained the situation, my voice steady but laced with frustration and hurt. Richard listened carefully, asking questions about the ownership and any agreements that might have been made. When I mentioned the deed and my concerns about the renovations and possible sale, he paused before responding. "From what you've told me, the house is still legally yours, Margaret. Unless you've signed over the title or there's some agreement I don't know about, you have the right to stay. They can't just decide to remove you or sell without your consent." Hearing those words was like a breath of fresh air. For the first time since the eviction began, a flicker of hope ignited inside me. Richard promised to review the documents and offered to come by the next day. He was cautious but clear this would be a legal battle and I needed to be prepared. "But you're not alone," he assured me. "We'll explore every avenue to protect your rights." The next morning, Richard arrived, a man in his 70s with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He laid out the papers on my kitchen table and began explaining the process, what steps to take, how to respond to any legal notices, and the importance of documenting everything. He also warned me to be careful about any pressure to sign documents or agreements from my son or his wife. "They might try to manipulate you into giving up your rights," he said. "Stay firm, don't sign anything without consulting me first." That afternoon, armed with newfound knowledge and a quiet determination, I began drafting a letter to my son and daughter-in-law. I kept it measured but clear, stating my ownership of the property and my intention to protect it. I reminded them of the years I had dedicated to the family home and requested that any plans regarding the house be discussed with me moving forward. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a mixture of apprehension and resolve. This was no longer just about a building, it was about standing up for myself in the face of betrayal and indifference. Later that week, I reached out to neighbors who had witnessed the movers and the activity around the house. Some were sympathetic, recalling overheard conversations and odd deliveries. Their support, though quiet, was encouraging. I made notes of their names and contact information, knowing that their testimonies might be valuable if the situation escalated. Each day, I spent hours poring over the documents Richard had given me and jotting down detailed accounts of every interaction with my son and daughter-in-law. I recorded dates, times, and the tone of conversations, building a clear picture of the unfolding situation. At times, the weight of it all felt overwhelming. I was navigating unfamiliar territory, wrestling with feelings of hurt and betrayal while trying to remain composed and strategic. But every step forward, no matter how small, strengthened my resolve. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sunset, I thought about the home I had lost, not just the physical space but the sense of belonging. I realized that reclaiming my house was about more than bricks and mortar. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, and my place in the family. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, but I was no longer the passive woman who had sat helplessly as her life was packed into boxes. I had found allies, gathered evidence, and most importantly, rediscovered my own strength. With Richard's guidance and the support of friends and neighbors, I was ready to face whatever came next. The house might have been emptying out, but I was filling myself with determination and hope. This was my home, my right, and I was prepared to fight to keep it. The diner was dimly lit, the kind of place where you could sit in a booth for hours without anyone bothering you. I chose a corner seat, away from the windows, my hands wrapped tightly around a cup of lukewarm coffee. Across from me sat my son and his wife, faces set with an uncomfortable mix of impatience and forced civility. The air between us was thick, heavy with unspoken words and years of simmering tension finally bubbling to the surface. They had called me here, presumably to talk things through, but I sensed the real reason was to pressure me into signing papers that would transfer ownership of the house to them. I could see it in the way my son shuffled documents nervously, in the cold calculation behind his wife's polite smile. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Before we begin," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I want to make one thing clear. The house belongs to me, I have the legal documents to prove it, and I have no intention of signing anything that relinquishes my rights." My son's face flushed with embarrassment, but he tried to mask it with a tight smile. "Mom, we're family, this is just to make things easier for everyone, we want to help you, not fight you." His words felt hollow, like a rehearsed line meant to soften the blow. I met his gaze steadily. "Help, by forcing me out, by packing my life into boxes without so much as a conversation. You love the house more than you love me." His wife leaned forward, her tone clipped and unyielding. "You're making this difficult. We've been more than patient. It's time to face the facts." I felt a surge of something fierce rise within me, anger, yes, but also clarity. For too long I had been soft-spoken, accommodating, hoping for understanding that never came. Not this time, not anymore. "No," I said, voice unwavering. "I will not vacate this home unless I choose to. I will not sign over anything without my full consent. This is my house." They exchanged a glance, a brief flicker of frustration passing between them, but I held my ground, refusing to be intimidated or dismissed. After what felt like an eternity, my son sighed and leaned back. "Fine, we'll give you some time, but don't expect this to go on forever." I nodded, sensing that this was as much a warning as a concession. I wasn't naive, I knew the battle was far from over. Returning home that evening, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and empowerment. I walked up the driveway and inserted the key into the front door lock, the familiar click echoing like a small victory. As the door swung open, I stepped inside, breathing in the scent of worn carpet and faded wallpaper, the scent of home. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching the banister, running my fingers along the windowsills. This space belonged to me, and I was reclaiming it not just physically but emotionally. In the living room, I found the box of photo albums that had been left behind, carefully unpacked them, and spread the pictures across the coffee table. Each image told a story: birthdays, holidays, quiet afternoons with my husband, laughter with grandchildren. They were reminders of a life lived fully, of roots that ran deep. I closed the door firmly behind me and turned the lock twice, as if sealing a promise to myself. This was my space, my sanctuary. No one could take that away without a fight. That night, as I lay in bed, the echoes of the day's confrontation lingered in my mind. The fear of losing everything was still there, but beneath it was a growing strength, a determination that I would not be erased. I thought about the future, about how I could rebuild not just the house but my sense of self. The battle for the home was also a battle for respect, for recognition, for dignity. In the days that followed, I took small steps to assert my presence. I began making repairs around the house, fixing a leaky faucet here, repainting a chipped wall there. Each task was a declaration: I belonged here, this was my life. Neighbors stopped by more often, some offering quiet words of encouragement, others curious about the unfolding drama. Their support, however subtle, bolstered my resolve. At times, my son and daughter-in-law would call or stop by, their voices tinged with impatience or thinly veiled frustration. I responded with calm firmness, refusing to be drawn into arguments or manipulations. One afternoon, I found a letter slipped under my door, an official notice regarding the property. I read it carefully, then called Richard, the lawyer. Together, we reviewed the contents and planned my next steps. Each legal hurdle was daunting, but I was no longer alone. As weeks passed, the house began to feel more like mine again. The weight of uncertainty lifted slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism. I was no longer the passive victim of circumstance, I was an active participant in my own life. Standing in the kitchen one evening, watching the sunset paint the walls in warm hues, I realized how far I had come. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but I had taken back control of my home, my story, and myself. Weeks had passed since the tense meeting at the diner, and the air around my home had shifted. No longer was there a sense of impending eviction or hurried packing. Instead, a quiet, resolute calm settled over the neighborhood. I had taken comfort in small routines: watering the garden, fixing the creaky door hinges, and savoring the familiar creak of the wooden floors beneath my feet. But beneath the surface, a legal battle was quietly unfolding. One bright morning, as I tended to the rose bushes I had so carefully replanted, a stern-faced man in a crisp suit appeared at the gate. He introduced himself as an official from the local courthouse, presenting documents that would soon become my shield. An eviction notice had been filed not against me but against my sons-in-laws, the ones who had moved in after I was asked to leave. The irony was not lost on me. I invited the man inside, and as he explained the details, a sense of vindication began to bloom within me. The law had recognized my rightful ownership and had taken steps to enforce it. The notice was a clear message: the house was mine, and those who had tried to claim it without consent would have to leave. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors stopped by with smiles and nods, their eyes reflecting a newfound respect. Some shared stories of quiet conversations with my son and daughter-in-law, revealing the tension and frustration beneath their composed exteriors. It was clear that my assertion of rights had unsettled the family dynamics, and I could sense the shifting tides. I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't experienced in years. The house, once a symbol of loss and exclusion, now stood as a testament to my resilience. Each creaking floorboard and faded wallpaper told a story of survival and strength. Community support grew in subtle ways. A neighbor offered to help with gardening, another brought over a batch of homemade soup on a chilly evening. These gestures, small but sincere, knitted a network of solidarity around me. I was no longer isolated in my fight. I was part of a community that valued justice and respect. Legal proceedings continued, with Richard guiding me through every twist and turn. His steady presence was a balm against the uncertainty, and together we prepared for what lay ahead. We gathered witness statements from neighbors who had observed the eviction preparations and the tense interactions. We documented every communication from my son and daughter-in-law, building a case grounded in fact and fairness. Despite the strain, I found moments of peace within these walls. I spent time in the garden, watching the roses bloom anew, their delicate petals a reminder that beauty could arise even after hardship. I began to see my home not just as a place of conflict, but as a canvas for renewal. The family's attempts to pressure me waned as the legal reality became undeniable. Phone calls grew infrequent, and their voices carried a cautious tone when they did reach out. I no longer felt the need to respond to every demand or insult. My silence became a statement of strength. One afternoon, as I sat by the window with a book, I noticed the eviction notice posted on the front door for all to see. It was a symbol not just of legal victory but of boundaries firmly established. The house belonged to me, and those who tried to disregard that truth had been held accountable. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the shock of betrayal, the long nights of uncertainty, the slow rebuilding of confidence. It was a path I never wanted to walk, yet it had taught me invaluable lessons about self-worth, resilience, and the power of standing up for oneself. As the days grew warmer, I began planning small renovations to restore the house's charm. I imagined repainting the walls in soft, comforting colors, repairing the worn steps leading to the porch, and creating spaces that reflected my personality and dreams. This was my home, and I intended to make it a place of peace and happiness once again. Neighbors stopped by more often now, sharing smiles and stories. The once quiet street seemed to pulse with quiet energy, a community knit closer by the unfolding drama and its resolution. I felt a sense of belonging not just within my home but within this circle of support. Though the future remained uncertain in many ways, I no longer feared it. I had reclaimed my place not just in the house but in my own life. The legal victory was more than a document. It was a declaration that I mattered, that my rights could not be erased by convenience or cruelty. At night, as I locked the door and settled into my favorite chair, I allowed myself a moment of quiet gratitude. The house was mine again, not just by law but in spirit. The fight had been hard, the wounds deep, but through it all, I had found strength I didn't know I possessed. This chapter was far from over, but I knew I was ready for whatever came next. The house was no longer a battleground, it was a home reclaimed, a sanctuary restored. And I was no longer the woman who had been pushed aside, I was a woman who had stood tall. The first stroke of paint on the living room wall felt like a quiet victory. As the soft cream color spread across the faded wallpaper, I stood back and felt the room breathe anew. This house, once a symbol of loss and betrayal, was becoming a canvas for my rebirth. Every brushstroke was a reclaiming of space, a declaration that I was here and I belonged. The renovations were slow but deliberate. I chose colors that felt warm and inviting, soft blues, gentle yellows, hues that reflected the calm I was determined to cultivate. I repaired the creaky floorboards, polished the worn banister, and planted new roses in the garden, their delicate blooms a testament to resilience and renewal. Neighbors stopped by more often now, offering help, sharing stories, and bringing small gifts. A basket of fresh vegetables, homemade jams, a bouquet of wildflowers. Their kindness wrapped around me like a comforting shawl, a reminder that I was not alone in this new chapter. I set firm boundaries with my family, a difficult but necessary step. Phone calls from my son and daughter-in-law became infrequent, their attempts to manipulate or guilt me met with gentle but unwavering refusals. I realized that love without respect was not love at all, and I would no longer accept anything less than dignity. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch swing, the warm sun filtering through the trees, I thought about how far I had come. The woman who had once been pushed out, silenced, and discarded was now standing tall. I was no longer defined by my roles as a mother or caretaker. I was simply Margaret, whole, independent, and free. The house felt alive again, filled not just with memories but with possibility. I transformed the spare bedroom into a studio where I painted and wrote, rediscovering passions that had been buried beneath years of sacrifice. The scent of fresh paint mingled with the aroma of blooming roses, a fragrant reminder of growth. Friends invited me to community events, and I found joy in new connections and old friendships rekindled. I volunteered at a local center, sharing my story to inspire others facing difficult family dynamics. The pain I had endured became a beacon for healing, not just for me, but for those who needed to hear that they were not alone. Each night, as I locked the door and settled into my favorite chair, I felt a profound peace. This was more than a house, it was a sanctuary reclaimed. The battles fought within these walls had forged a new strength, a resilience that could not be broken. Looking out the window at the garden bathed in moonlight, I smiled. I had lost much, but in that loss I had found myself. The journey was far from over, but I was ready to live, to love, and to bloom in the light of my own life.